There are moments in life that are meant for high places. Celebrations, proposals, the kinds of announcements that seem to demand a view of the world stretching out below, as if to say, look how far we've come. We measure our ascents in feet above sea level, in floors climbed, in the number of city lights that twinkle beneath us like a fallen galaxy. I used to believe that. I used to think that the higher you climbed, the further you were from the sorrows of the ground. But sorrow, I've learned, has a way of finding you. It takes the elevator. It doesn't need a reservation. Tonight I was at the summit. The name itself was a promise, a declaration. A restaurant perched atop a New York skyscraper, encased in glass walls that held the city at a polite distance. The air hummed with the low thrum of success, the clinking of heavy wine glasses, the murmur of conversations about markets and mergers, the soft scrape of silver on porcelain. I sat at our table, a small island in a sea of glittering people, and felt like a ghost. I was wearing my blue dress. It was a good dress, made of silk that felt like a memory against my skin, tailored and elegant in a way that was popular a decade ago. It was the dress I wore to my own retirement dinner from the university, a lifetime ago. Tonight, against the backdrop of 1,000 winking lights and the sharp, modern angles of the furniture, it felt less like a classic and more like a relic. Much like the woman wearing it, across from me sat my children. Or rather, the glorious, polished adults my children had become. Mason, my son, was a portrait of ambition realized. His suit was a shade of charcoal so dark it seemed to drink the light, tailored to fit a body honed by expensive gym memberships. He had the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no, or perhaps had simply never listened when he was. Beside him, my daughter Olivia was his perfect counterpart. She was luminous, her designer dress shimmering with every slight movement, her hair a cascade of blonde waves that looked artfully effortless, a look I knew cost a small fortune and 3 hours in a salon chair to achieve. They didn't look like my children. They looked like stars that had wandered in from a different, brighter solar system. "Isn't this something, Mom?" Mason said, sweeping a hand towards the window. The Empire State Building stood sentinel in the distance, its spire a needle stitching the sky. "A long way from the garage, huh?" I smiled, a genuine heart-swelling smile. "A very long way, honey." The garage, that was where Aura Health had been born. A cluttered, oil-stained space where Mason, fresh out of business school with a dream bigger than his budget, had set up 2 trestle tables and a used computer. He had the vision, I had the science. And the money. The waiter arrived with the appetizers, intricate constructions of seafood and foam that looked more like art than food. Olivia took a picture of hers for her social media followers, her thumb tapping expertly on the screen. Celebrating something huge with the family, she narrated to her phone, her voice a shade warmer than the one she used with me. "Big things coming." The air was thick with anticipation. They had called me a week ago, their voices braided with an excitement I hadn't heard since they were children on Christmas morning. "We have big news, Mom. The biggest. Meet us at the summit. We're celebrating." And so here I was, sipping water from a crystal goblet that weighed more than my teacups at home, my heart a hummingbird in my chest for them. It was always for them. After the waiter cleared the plates, Mason leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. He had a flair for the dramatic, my son. He took a breath, looked at Olivia, and then at me. "It's done," he said, his voice low but resonant. "Aura Health is being acquired, a pharmaceutical giant. The final offer is $200 million. The number hung in the air, vast and incomprehensible. $200,000,000. It wasn't a sum of money, it was a concept, an escape velocity from every worry I had ever known. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden. The city lights blurred into a watercolor painting. "Oh, Mason," I whispered, my hand flying to my chest. "Oh, my darling boy." In that single, glittering moment, I saw it all. I saw the day I signed the papers to sell my parents' house, the cozy brick home where I grew up, its scent of old books and dried lavender replaced by the sterile smell of a realtor's ink. I saw the bank teller's professionally blank face as I authorized the transfer that drained my entire retirement account, the 40 years of careful saving, of planning for a quiet old age, reduced to a string of zeros on a receipt. Nearly $1 million. It wasn't just money. It was the final chapter of my parents' story, the safety net of my own future, every last dime I had in the world. I had bundled it all up and handed it to my son. A leap of faith, they call it. For mother, it is simply an act of breathing. You give your oxygen to your child, believing they will use it to reach heights you never could. And he had soared. My joy was pure, a bright, beautiful thing. It was the validation of every sacrifice, the silencing of every doubt. It was the happy ending. But happy endings, I've learned, are often just a beautiful story told before the final page is turned. Olivia reached across the table and placed her cool, smooth hand on mine. Her smile was gentle, but her eyes held a strange, unreadable pity. Mom, she began, her voice soft. With this big change, Mason and I have been doing a lot of planning, looking at the finances from all angles. I nodded, still dabbing at my eyes with my napkin. Of course, dear, it's a lot to manage. It is. Mason picked up, his tone shifting. The warmth was gone, replaced by a crisp boardroom efficiency. And in situations like this, you have to be strategic. We need to streamline everything to finalize the deal. We need to cut any unnecessary expenses. He said the words unnecessary expenses while looking directly at me. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A cold dread, slick and heavy, began to creep up my spine. Your apartment, Mom, Olivia continued, squeezing my hand. The rent is, well, it's a lot. It's an expense we can't justify right now. Justify? I echoed, my voice a faint whisper. We've found a wonderful place for you, Mason said, his voice brisk as if he were discussing a logistical problem. A senior living community in suburban New Jersey. It's safe, quiet, and most importantly, it's far more cost-effective. It will be a much more sensible arrangement. The city lights outside seemed to dim. The humming of the restaurant faded to a dull roar in my ears. They were talking about shipping me away. They were talking about my life as if it were a line item on a budget. But my investment, I managed, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. My share in the company. I was your first investor, Mason, the only one. Mason laughed. It was not the sound of joy. It was a cold, sharp sound like glass breaking. Oh, Mom, he said, shaking his head with a condescending smile. Please don't be naive. That was a gift. You gave me that money. There were no papers, no contracts. It was family. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You don't understand business. This is how the world works. We know what's best for you, Olivia added, her voice dripping with a cloying, false sympathy that was more insulting than his cruelty. They spoke about me as if I weren't there. A problem to be solved. A financial drag to be managed. A mother to be stored away. This wasn't a celebration. It was a notice of eviction. They hadn't brought me to the summit to share in their victory. They had brought me here to push me off the ledge. I sat there in my old blue dress, surrounded by the staggering wealth my own life had paid for. The food on my plate was tasteless. The wine in my glass might as well have been poison. I looked at the beautiful, successful strangers across the table, the children I had given everything for, and I understood. I wasn't an investor. I wasn't their mother. I was an unnecessary expense, and I had just been cut. The ride down in the elevator was a silent, 1,600-foot descent back to a world that no longer felt like mine. Mason had paid for the car service, a final, perfunctory gesture of the life I was being evicted from. He and Olivia had hugged me goodbye at the elevator doors, their embraces quick and brittle, like the rustle of dry leaves. There were no apologies in their eyes, only the faint, impatient flicker of a task completed. The deal was done. The mother was handled. I sat in the back of the black town car, a ghost in the machine, watching the city lights smear across the window. New York at night is a symphony of light and life, a million stories unfolding at once. But tonight, the glittering towers looked like tombstones, and the endless river of headlights felt like a funeral procession. The driver, a kind man with tired eyes, tried to make small talk. Quite a view up there, huh? I could only nod, my throat a knot of unshed tears. How do you explain that you've just been shown the view from the top of the world, only to be told you have no place in it? The doorman of my building greeted me with a familiar smile. Good evening, Dr. Reed. For a moment, it was a comfort, the sound of my name, my title, a reminder of a person I used to be. but the comfort was fleeting, replaced by a fresh wave of grief. This man saw me as a respected resident, a fixture in this elegant pre-war building. Soon, he would see me hauling boxes, another tenant priced out of the neighborhood. Except I hadn't been priced out by the market, I had been disposed of by my own blood. The click of the key in my apartment door was a sound I'd heard thousands of times, but tonight it sounded different. Final. It was the sound of a lock turning on a life that was already over. I stepped inside and was met with a silence that was heavier than any noise. This apartment had been my sanctuary after my husband, Robert, passed away. It was smaller than our family home, but I had filled it with the best parts of our life: the mahogany armoire from his grandmother, the worn leather armchair he always sat in, the shelves overflowing with my books and his old records. It was a space curated by love and memory. Now, every object felt like an accusation. I walked into the living room, my hand trailing along the wall. My fingers brushed against the worn velvet of Robert's armchair. I could almost see him there, smiling, telling me, "You did good, Evie. The kids are set." But what would he say now? What would he say about the children we raised to be ambitious, who had become so ambitious they had outgrown their own mother? My gaze fell upon the bookshelf. Tucked between novels and poetry were my old medical journals, bound volumes filled with the meticulous notes of a career I had loved. Dr. Evelyn Reed. I had been a researcher of some renown, on the cusp of a breakthrough in neurological mapping. But then Mason's dream had taken root, and like any good mother, I had set aside my own garden to tend to his. I had traded my lab coat for a checkbook, my research grants for his business plans. I had believed I was investing in a new kind of legacy, one that would live and breathe through him. I never imagined he would take the harvest and then salt the earth behind him. I drifted into the small second bedroom, the one I used as a study. On the wall hung a framed photo of the three of us from 10 years ago, taken on Olivia's college graduation day. We were smiling, arms around each other. I looked so proud, so full of a fierce, boundless love. Looking at it now, I felt a chilling disconnect. Who was that woman, that hopeful, trusting mother? I felt as though I was looking at a photograph of a stranger. A fool. The phone on the end table began to ring, its shrill cry tearing through the quiet sanctity of my grief. My heart leaped with a sudden, stupid flicker of hope. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe they've thought about what they've done. Maybe they're calling to say they're sorry. I looked at the caller ID. It was Olivia. My hand trembled as I picked it up. "Hello?" My voice was hoarse. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was bright, chipper, completely devoid of the evening's tension. It was her public voice, the one she used for her followers. "I hope we didn't keep you out too late." I couldn't speak. The sheer, breathtaking normalcy of her tone was like a physical blow. "Anyway," she continued, oblivious to my silence, "I was just calling to follow up. I know tonight was a lot to take in, but Mason and I are on a bit of a tight timeline with the acquisition paperwork. So, I was just wondering if you'd had a chance to think about a possible moving date. The sooner we can get the apartment off our books, the cleaner the transition will be for the auditors." A moving date, off our books. Cleaner for the auditors. The words were like tiny, sharp icicles piercing my heart. There was no remorse, no empathy. This wasn't a difficult, emotional call for her. It was a business transaction. She was just following up. I was a loose end that needed to be tied up. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, the silence stretching between New York and wherever she was. I could hear the faint sound of music in the background on her end. She was probably still out, celebrating. I imagined her in a chic bar, surrounded by friends, laughing as she efficiently handled the disposal of her mother. Without a word, I pressed the end call button. I didn't slam the phone down. I didn't scream. I placed it back on its cradle with a strange, deliberate calm. The hope I hadn't even realized I was clinging to, that tiny, resilient weed, had finally been ripped out by the roots. The strength that had held me together all evening abandoned me. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, my back against the wall next to the smiling photograph. The tears that I had held back in the restaurant, in the taxi, in the lobby, finally came. They weren't loud, wrenching sobs, but a silent, steady stream, a river of grief for a loss so profound I couldn't even name it. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the home. It was the entire foundation of my life. It was the belief, foolish and naive as it now seemed, that a mother's love was a sacred, unbreakable bond. Tonight, I learned that it wasn't. It was just a resource. And mine had been fully depleted. I was no longer an asset. I was a liability. And in the cold, hard world my children had built for themselves, liabilities were always the first thing to be cut. The silence in the apartment was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of a life being erased. Grief, I have come to understand, is not a single violent storm. It is the quiet, gray devastation the storm leaves behind. It is the landscape after the flood, where familiar landmarks are gone, and all that remains is a chilling silence and the slow, arduous task of sorting through the wreckage. The tears eventually stopped, leaving my face stiff and cold, my body hollowed out. I rose from the floor sometime in the deep, anonymous hours of the morning, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a very old woman, though my age was only a number on a page. Inside, I felt ancient. The days that followed were a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. I existed within the four walls of my apartment, but I was no longer truly living there. I was a custodian of a museum dedicated to a life that had abruptly ended. I would make coffee I didn't drink, read pages of books I didn't comprehend. The phone remained silent. Olivia had made her point. A follow-up would no longer be necessary. The eviction was in progress. It was the boxes that finally forced me to move. Plain, brown, unforgiving cardboard boxes delivered and stacked in my hallway like a barricade. They were a physical manifestation of my children's decree. Your life here is over, pack it up. And so I began the somber archaeology of my own existence. I sorted my life into three piles: keep, donate, and trash. The process was a lesson in the brutal arithmetic of loss. The silver-framed photos of Mason and Olivia as children, laughing with chocolate-smeared faces, keep. The collection of poetry books Robert and I used to read to each other, keep. The expensive handbag Mason had given me for my birthday 2 years ago, a gesture I now understood as an investment in his own image, donate. The stack of birthday cards signed with a hurried, impersonal, love, M and O, trash. With each item I touched, I felt a layer of myself being stripped away. I was no longer the woman who hosted holiday dinners, the mother who kept every childhood drawing, the wife who cherished her late husband's records. I was becoming less and less, packing my identity away until all that was left was the task at hand. There was a strange mercy in the numbness. It was easier than feeling. It was in the back of the hall closet, buried under a stack of winter blankets that still smelled faintly of mothballs, that I found it. A single, heavy box sealed with yellowing tape. On the side, in my own neat, academic script, was written, E. Read Research Archives. I hadn't thought about this box in 15 years. It held the ghost of another me, the doctor, Evelyn Reed, who lived in a world of hypotheses and peer reviews, of sterile laboratories and the thrilling, electric promise of discovery. A part of me wanted to just leave it, to tape it shut and send it to a storage unit, another part of my past to be locked away. But my hands, acting of their own accord, pulled at the tape. The smell that rose from the box was the scent of my former life: old paper, ink, and the faint, dry scent of ambition. Inside, stacked in meticulous order, were my research papers, dissertations, and clinical trial notes. My work on degenerative neurological diseases. My life's work before my life became my children. I lifted out a heavy file folder. The label read, Project Chimera, Predictive Modeling of Neural Pathway Decay. My fingers, which had grown accustomed to the soft domesticity of cooking and cleaning, traced the complex diagrams and equations. I saw the passion in the detailed notes, the excitement in the margin scribbles. I remembered the woman who wrote them. She was brilliant, she was respected. She was on the verge of something that could have changed lives. She was not an unnecessary expense. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of a life I had willingly abandoned, and for the first time in days, I felt something other than grief. It was a faint, ghostly flicker of pride, a memory of my own worth, independent of my role as a mother. This was my legacy. Not the one I had tried to build through Mason, but the one I had forged myself in the quiet, focused world of science. It was a legacy he and Olivia knew nothing about. To them, my life began and ended with being their mother. I spent the rest of the afternoon lost in my own history, the packing forgotten. It was a bittersweet reunion with the woman I used to be. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room when I decided to take a break. On the coffee table was a business magazine I'd bought weeks ago, trying to better understand Mason's world. His face was on the cover, smiling that confident, world-conquering smile. The visionary behind Aura Health, the headline declared. With a sigh, I picked it up. I had read the article before with a mother's swelling pride. Now, I read it with the detached, clinical curiosity of a scientist. I skimmed past the fawning praise of his business acumen and focused on the description of the technology itself. Aura Health's revolutionary diagnostic tool, it read, utilizes a proprietary algorithm to analyze synaptic response patterns, creating a predictive model that can detect the earliest markers of neurodegeneration with unprecedented accuracy. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the technical jargon. Most of it was standard, but then I saw a phrase that made me pause. By mapping what Aura Health has termed synaptic echoes, the residual energy signatures left behind by decaying neural signals, synaptic echoes, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. It was a faint, nagging feeling, like a word on the tip of your tongue. I had heard that term before, or perhaps I had written it. My heart began to beat a little faster. I put the magazine down and turned back to the open box on the floor. My eyes scanned the labels on the files. I pulled one out, my hands moving with a sudden, urgent purpose. The file was thinner than the others, containing an older, more speculative piece of research. A theoretical paper I had written in my final year at the university. I opened it, my eyes flying across the page, past the introduction, past the methodology, until I found the section I was looking for. And there it was. On a page I hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades, in my own handwriting, was a paragraph outlining a radical, unproven theory. A theory about tracking the faint, residual energy signatures of dying neurons. A theory about what I had called, in a moment of scientific poetry, the echo of a synapse. I looked from my old, faded research paper to the glossy magazine with my son's triumphant face on the cover. A cold, terrifying bridge began to form between my stolen past and my shattered present. The numb, hollow grief that had filled my chest for days was slowly, quietly being replaced by something else entirely. Something sharp and focused and dangerously clear. It was the mind of a scientist, awakened from a long slumber, and it had just found a question that demanded an answer. There is a moment after the initial shock of a discovery when the world snaps back into sharp, unforgiving focus. The fog of grief, which had softened the edges of my reality, burned away, leaving behind the stark, crystalline clarity of the truth. I was no longer just a mother betrayed. I was a scientist whose life's work had been stolen. The two realities collided within me, and in their violent fusion, something new was forged. Not hope, not yet. It was something harder. Colder, it was purpose. The boxes in the hallway no longer looked like a barricade. They were an inconvenience, a logistical problem to be managed. The numb, aimless wandering of the past few days was over. I moved through my apartment with a newfound energy, a humming, electric current that had its source in the box of old papers still open on my floor. I made a pot of coffee, strong and black, and this time I drank it. A scientist does not run on emotion. She runs on data. My observation, the eerie similarity between my theoretical paper and the description of Aura Health's technology, was for now just that, an observation. It needed to be a hypothesis, and a hypothesis needed to be tested. It needed evidence. Rigorous, irrefutable evidence. My old notes were the starting point, but they were a map of a world from 2 decades ago. To prove the connection, I needed to see the landscape of the present. I needed access to patent databases, corporate filings, and the latest scientific journals, resources I no longer had at my fingertips. The university credentials that once opened every digital door were long expired. And so, my first move in this new, unwanted war was not a dramatic confrontation or a tearful phone call. It was a trip on the downtown subway to the Stephen A. Schwarzman building of the New York Public Library. I walked up the grand stone steps, past the iconic marble lions, patience, and fortitude. I felt a grim sense of irony. I would need both in the days to come. Inside, the Rose main reading room was a cathedral of silence and study, its vast ceiling painted with a sky far more serene than the one in my own heart. In another life, I had done research here as a young graduate student, full of dreams. Today, I was here as a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that had cast me out, armed with nothing but a library card and a terrible suspicion. I found an available public computer in a quiet alcove, its screen glowing with an impersonal welcome. This was my new laboratory, a shared, sterile space, a universe away from the state-of-the-art facilities I once commanded. I sat down, took a deep breath, and began to dig. I started with the public filings for the acquisition. Layers of dense, legal jargon designed to obscure as much as to reveal, but I knew how to read such documents. I was looking for the technical appendices, the places where the technology itself had to be described for due diligence. It took an hour, but I found them. Then I cross-referenced them with the patent filings for Aura Health's core algorithm, patent US 10, 874, 321b2. I began to read, and it was like listening to a distorted echo of my own voice. The language was cloaked in the slick, confident terminology of a modern tech startup, but the underlying concepts, the foundational architecture of the idea, were mine. It was all there. My three-stage process for analyzing neural feedback loops. My unique approach to data filtering. And then I saw it. The phrase itself, buried deep in a paragraph on page 12 of the patent description. The system then quantifies these residual energy signatures, or synaptic echoes, to build a probability matrix. He had used my exact words. My poetic, private little term for a theory no one else had ever seen. He had lifted it whole and planted it in the heart of his $200 million empire. A hot flush of anger, pure and potent, washed over me. This was no coincidence. This was not a case of parallel thinking or unconscious inspiration. This was theft. I kept digging, my fingers flying across the keyboard. My grief had made me slow and uncertain. This cold, clarifying rage made me fast. I found the white papers Mason's company had published to attract investors. I found the technical diagrams submitted with the patent application. And in one of those diagrams, I found the smoking gun. It was a flowchart illustrating the algorithm's decision-making process. It was nearly identical to a sketch from my own theoretical paper, a sketch I was now looking at on my phone from a photo I'd taken before I left the apartment. But it wasn't just the similarity that was damning. It was the flaw. In my original sketch, I had made a small, conceptual error in one of the feedback loops, an error I had later identified and corrected in my handwritten notes. Mason's patent diagram contained the exact same error. It was the kind of mistake a true inventor, someone who understood the science from the ground up, would have caught and corrected. But it was an error a plagiarist, someone who was simply copying a blueprint without understanding the architecture, would reproduce perfectly. I leaned back in the hard, wooden chair, the dull hum of the library's ventilation system filling the sudden silence in my mind. The world tilted on its axis. The betrayal I had felt at the summit was a shallow cut compared to this. The money, the house, the savings, I had given him those things. It was a sacrifice made out of love. This, my work, my mind, my intellectual soul, this he had stolen. A mother expects to give her children her heart. She does not expect them to come back and steal her mind. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of the monitor. For a moment, I saw the face of a tired, 58-year-old woman, lines of grief etched around her eyes. But as I looked closer, I saw someone else emerging from behind the sorrow. It was the face of Dr. Evelyn Reed, and she was not a victim. She was a scientist who had just proven her hypothesis. The data was conclusive. My work for the day was done. I methodically downloaded every document, every patent, every article, and saved them to a small, encrypted USB drive I had bought on my way to the library. It was a tiny thing, no bigger than my thumb, but it held the weight of a monumental crime. It was my evidence. It was my weapon. I walked out of the library and back into the late afternoon light of the city. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The city no longer looked like a graveyard, it looked like a battlefield. The question that had been haunting me for days, how could they do this to me, was gone. It had been replaced by a new one, a better one. A question that held the promise of a future I would forge for myself. What am I going to do about it? Back in my apartment, the small USB drive felt heavy in my palm, a tiny, dense star of cold fury. I held in my hand the proof of my son's deception, a digital record of a betrayal so profound it had redefined the very meaning of the word. But I knew with the cold clarity that had become my constant companion that evidence is not the same as justice. Evidence is a silent, sleeping thing. To wake it up, to give it a voice, it needs a witness. The world, I knew, would be predisposed to disbelieve me. The narrative was already written in my children's favor. A wildly successful young entrepreneur and his glamorous sister, generously caring for their aging, perhaps confused mother. A mother's accusations, no matter how well founded, could easily be dismissed as bitterness, jealousy, or worse, the ramblings of a mind beginning to fail. I had seen it happen to colleagues, their contributions erased, their legacies rewritten by younger, more powerful voices. No, I could not fight this war alone. I needed an ally. Not just a friend who would offer sympathy, but someone who spoke my language, the language of science. My mind, sifting through the archives of my life, settled on a name I had not spoken in years, Dr. Benjamin Carter. Ben and I had started at the university in the same year. He was a physicist, brilliant and intense, with a mind that saw the universe in elegant, beautiful equations. I was a biologist, fascinated by the chaotic, messy systems of life. We were, in many ways, opposites, but we had forged a friendship in the crucible of late-night lab sessions and the shared pressure to publish or perish. He was a good man, a kind man, but more than that, he was a man who revered the truth. He believed in the sanctity of an idea, in the moral ownership of a discovery. He would understand the nature of the crime that had been committed against me. The question was, where was he now? And would he even remember me? It took only a few minutes on the library's computer to find him. Dr. Benjamin Carter was no longer just a professor. He was the dean of scientific research at Columbia University, a position of immense prestige and influence. A part of me shrank from the thought of contacting him. I felt like a failure, a footnote from his past, calling from a life of domestic obscurity to beg for help. But the image of Mason's condescending smile at the restaurant pushed me forward. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I drafted the email a dozen times, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. In the end, I kept it simple, professional, appealing to the scientist, not the friend. Dear Dr. Carter, my name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. We were colleagues at NYU some years ago. I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to request a brief moment of your time to discuss an academic matter of some urgency. My recent review of a prominent new patent in the field of neurodiagnostics has raised some serious questions of intellectual provenance that I believe would be of interest to you. Sincerely, Evelyn Reed, PhD. I hit send before I could lose my nerve. The wait for his reply was agonizing. Every minute that passed felt like a small rejection, a confirmation of my irrelevance. But less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a notification. Evie, of course I remember you. It's been far too long, your work was unforgettable. I'm intrigued and concerned by your message. When and where can we meet? Best, Ben. We met the next afternoon at a small, crowded cafe on the edge of the Columbia campus. The place smelled of dark roast coffee and old books, a scent that felt more like home to me than my own apartment did these days. Ben looked older, of course. His dark hair was now a distinguished silver, and he wore glasses perched on his nose, but his eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and kind. Evie, he said, standing to greet me, his smile genuine and warm. You look exactly the same. It was a kind lie, but I appreciated it. We spent a few minutes catching up, the awkward but pleasant dance of two people trying to bridge a 15-year gap. We talked about his work, his family, my late husband. Then a natural silence fell between us. It was time. I took a deep breath and opened the laptop I'd brought. Ben, I began, my voice steady. What I'm about to show you is going to sound unbelievable. I need you to listen to me not as a friend, but as a scientist. He leaned forward, his expression serious. I'm listening. I started from the beginning, not the dinner, not the money. I started with the science. I showed him my old theoretical paper on synaptic echoes. I explained the methodology, the core concepts, the future work I had planned before I left academia. Then I pulled up the patent for Aura Health. I didn't editorialize, I didn't cry. I simply presented the data, side by side, on the screen of the laptop. I pointed to the terminology, the copied methodology, the shared architecture. Ben was silent, his eyes moving back and forth between the two documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was no longer looking at me, his old friend. He was analyzing a problem. Finally, I showed him the last piece of evidence, the two diagrams, mine with the conceptual flaw, Mason's with the exact same flaw reproduced in perfect, damning detail. This, I said, my voice quiet but firm, was my mistake, Ben. A mistake I found and corrected in my notes, but never in this draft, and he copied it. He copied my mistake perfectly. Ben leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes as if the screen had physically pained him. The skeptical scientist was gone. In his place was a man looking at a crime scene. My God, Evie, he whispered. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of my story land in someone else's eyes. He saw the theft. He saw the violation. Who filed this patent? I hesitated, the next words feeling like treason on my tongue. My son, I said, Mason Reed. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock and a deep, profound sorrow on my behalf. He didn't offer empty platitudes or condolences. He offered something far better. This is more than a family dispute, Evie, he said, his voice now hard with a protective anger. This is a fundamental breach of scientific ethics. It is fraud, plain and simple. He slid the laptop back towards me, but his posture had shifted. He was no longer a spectator. He was an ally. What do you need? He asked. Access to our university's research databases? Our legal team for intellectual property? A lab to verify the data? You name it, Columbia will stand with you. As I left the cafe, the late afternoon sun felt warm on my face. The weight I had been carrying, the terrible burden of knowing I was alone in this fight, had lessened. I was no longer a ghost haunting a library. I was Dr. Evelyn Reed, a scientist with a validated hypothesis and a powerful colleague at her side. The war was far from over, but for the first time since that night at the summit, I was no longer fighting it alone. I had a partner. We had a plan. And my first move was finally complete. There is a unique and profound peace to be found in a laboratory. It is a world stripped of ambiguity, a sanctuary built of glass and steel where passions are channeled into process, and emotion is subservient to evidence. It is a place where the chaotic questions of the human heart are silenced by the quiet, orderly pursuit of a verifiable truth. For me, stepping into the Advanced Research Center at Columbia University, with its faint, clean scent of antiseptic and the low, steady hum of servers processing unimaginable amounts of data, felt like coming home after a long and brutal exile. Ben met me at the entrance, handing me a freshly printed ID card with my picture on it. Guest researcher, Dr. Evelyn Reed? It read. He swiped it to open the heavy glass doors to the main computational biology lab. The soft click of the lock was, for me, the sound of a door opening back into my own life. Welcome back to the land of the living, Evie, he said with a small smile. For the next week, that lab became my entire world. Ben had assigned us a small, private workspace with two powerful workstations. He gave me his login credentials, granting me access to the university's vast digital libraries and proprietary databases, the keys to a kingdom I thought I had lost forever. the boxes in my apartment, the looming threat of a New Jersey retirement home, the memory of my children's cold eyes. All of it faded into the background, replaced by the immediate, all-consuming challenge of the data. We were not just rereading my old notes, we were resurrecting them. Our goal was to build a functional simulation of the Aura Health algorithm based on the architecture described in the patent. We were, in essence, reverse engineering my son's creation to see if the ghost of my own work still lived inside it. The days fell into a rhythm of quiet, intense work. We'd spend hours in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the soft clicking of our keyboards and the occasional murmur as one of us pointed out a line of code or a specific data set. It was a partnership of minds, a stark and comforting contrast to the strained, transactional conversations I'd had with my own family. Here, in this world, my ideas had value. My intellect was my currency. As we delved deeper, I felt the old instincts returning, the muscle memory of a life spent in research. I could see the ghost of my thinking in the algorithm's structure, but it was a cruder, less elegant version. Mason, or the team he had hired, had followed my blueprint, but they had missed the nuance, the subtlety. They had built the engine but had no real understanding of how it worked. They saw the what, but not the why. He never understood the feedback loop. I murmured to Ben late one afternoon, pointing to a complex section of the simulation. This part here, the way it recalibrates after processing an anomalous signal, it was the most unstable part of my original theory. It was a starting point, a question I hadn't answered yet. What do you mean unstable? Ben asked, peering at the screen. I designed it to be highly sensitive to look for the faintest possible signals of decay, I explained. But that sensitivity came at a cost. It had a tendency, in my early models, to overinterpret the data, to see patterns that weren't there. It could create false positives. I had pages of notes on how to build in safeguards, checks, and balances to control it, but those notes weren't in the paper he stole. A sudden, cold thought took root in my mind. Ben saw the look on my face. What is it, Evie? Let's push it, I said. Let's run a stress test. Let's feed the simulation a data set of 100 perfectly healthy neural scans, but let's mix in some high-level background noise, the kind of data anomalies you'd get from a faulty scanner or a patient with a mild fever. Ben nodded, his fingers already flying across the keyboard, setting up the parameters. We initiated the simulation, and for a few minutes we watched in silence as the algorithm worked. At first, everything seemed normal. The system correctly identified the first dozen scans as healthy. But then, it hit the first scan with the background noise. The screen began to fill with red. The model, my hypersensitive, unchecked model, interpreted the data noise as a potential threat. It saw the faint, meaningless anomaly and classified it as an early-stage synaptic echo. It flagged a perfectly healthy 45-year-old male for early-onset Alzheimer's. It's a single false positive, Ben said, his voice tight. It could be a glitch. Keep it running, I said, my eyes glued to the screen. We watched as the simulation continued. It cleared the next few healthy scans, but then another noisy data set appeared, and again, a cascade of red warnings flooded the screen. Another false positive. By the time the simulation had processed all 100 scans, the results were horrifying. Of the 20 scans with background noise, the algorithm had misdiagnosed 8 of them as showing signs of neurodegeneration. A 40% false positive rate under stress. I leaned back, a chill running through me that had nothing to do with the lab's air conditioning. Mason hadn't just stolen my work. He had stolen my unfinished work. He had taken a theoretical engine, a fragile prototype, and bolted it into the chassis of a commercial product without understanding the brakes. My God, Ben whispered, looking at the screen. Does he know? He can't, I said. To him, the science was just a means to an end. It was the secret sauce he needed to get funding. He wouldn't have known how to properly test it or what to even look for. Ben stood up and began to pace, the full, catastrophic implications of our discovery dawning on him. Evie, do you realize what this means? The acquiring company, their due diligence must have been superficial. They bought the promise, not the reality. If this flaw becomes public, the entire $200 million deal will be jeopardized. Aura Health won't just lose its value, it will be buried in lawsuits from patients who receive false diagnoses. We're not just talking about financial ruin, we're talking about a public health disaster. I looked at the screen, at the sea of red error messages that represented the fatal flaw in my son's empire. The evidence I had found in the library could prove he was a thief. But this was different. This data proved he was a fraud, and a reckless one at that. The power dynamic had shifted in a way I could never have imagined. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. This was about controlling a ticking time bomb. The knowledge in my head. The data on this screen, it was no longer just a tool for justice. It was a weapon. A secret weapon of immense, devastating power. And I was the only one in the world who knew how to use it. Power, I was learning, did not feel like a sword. I had imagined that discovering the truth, seizing the advantage, would feel like a weapon materializing in my hand, hard, sharp, and righteous. But as I sat with Ben in the quiet, humming lab, staring at the screen full of my son's catastrophic failure, what I felt was not the triumphant heft of a sword. It felt like a scalpel, a tool of immense, terrifying precision. A tool that could be used to cut away a cancer, but in the wrong hands or with a moment's hesitation could sever something vital. Ben broke the long silence, his voice low. "So what's the play, Evie?" He had turned his chair to face me, the glowing screen of data now at our backs. The question wasn't about the science anymore, it was about the war. "I don't know," I admitted, and the honesty of it felt heavy. "For the first time in my life, I hold all the cards, and I'm terrified I'll play the wrong hand. We could go to a lawyer," he suggested, thinking aloud. "File a lawsuit for intellectual property theft. With this evidence, we'd have a strong case." I shook my head, the scenario playing out in my mind. And it would become a spectacle. Bitter Mother Sue's golden boy son. It would drag on for years. They would paint me as vindictive, as unstable. My son's lawyers would tear my life apart on the stand, and by the time it was over, the truth would be buried under a mountain of legal fees and character assassination. Mason would lose, but in a way, I would too. The press, then, Ben offered. An anonymous tip to a reputable science journalist. The story of a dangerous medical device is a big one, and the headline would be the same, I countered. The story would inevitably circle back to the family drama. The human interest angle would eclipse the scientific fraud. People would be more interested in the betrayal than the bad data. The nuance, the real danger, would be lost. I looked at Ben, my voice hardening with a resolve I didn't know I possessed. "I have been invisible for too long, Ben. I have been the quiet mother, the silent supporter, the forgotten scientist. I'm not going to let them make me a footnote in my own story, not again." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the university campus. Students walked along the paths below, their lives full of a future they took for granted. I had a future once, too. Mason hadn't just stolen it, he had tried to erase it. "We can't fight him in his world of boardrooms and press releases," I said, turning back to Ben. "He's better at that game than I am. We have to bring him into our world, the world of peer review, the world of empirical evidence. A world where the truth is not a matter of opinion or public relations, but a measurable, verifiable fact." A slow smile spread across Ben's face as he understood. "An academic conference," he said, the idea taking shape in the air between us. "A presentation." "Exactly," I affirmed. "No accusations, no family drama, just science. We present my original research, and then we present a follow-up study, our simulation, demonstrating the catastrophic instability of applying this theoretical model without the necessary safeguards. We lay out the data on the 40% false positive rate. We warn of the potential for mass misdiagnosis. We do it all under the guise of academic responsibility." Ben's mind, always 3 steps ahead, saw the genius in the plan. "The Global Neuroinnovation Symposium is in San Diego in 6 weeks," he said, his voice quickening with excitement. "It's the biggest event of the year. The entire industry will be there." He paused, a glint in his eye. In fact, I just saw the preliminary schedule. The keynote address on the first day is being given by the CEO of Omni Farm. Omni Farm, the pharmaceutical giant that was buying Aura Health. They'll be there to crow about their brilliant new acquisition, Ben continued. Their entire R&D department, their senior executive team, they will all be sitting in the front row of our presentation, Evie. They will walk right into it, completely unaware. The trap was elegant. It was deadly. It was perfect. We wouldn't have to throw the bomb. We would simply pull the pin, set it on the stage, and let them pick it up themselves. The energy in the room shifted. We were no longer just colleagues analyzing a problem. We were strategists planning a campaign. We would need to get on the symposium schedule, which was finalized months ago. Leave that to me, Ben said, already reaching for his phone. The weight of a name like Columbia University can move mountains or at least rearrange a conference schedule. While Ben was on the phone, pulling strings with a calm, authoritative diplomacy, I began to write. I drafted the title and abstract for our presentation. The words had to be perfect, academically sound, professionally detached, and utterly devastating in their implications. The title was a masterpiece of boring, academic language, a longitudinal analysis of signal-to-noise contamination in predictive neural models and the risk of stochastic resonance cascades. It was enough to make a layman's eyes glaze over, but to a specialist, it was a siren's song, hinting at a fundamental flaw in the very field they were celebrating. An hour later, it was done. Ben had secured us a slot on the second day of the conference, citing a significant and time-sensitive new research development from our department. We proofread the abstract one last time, every word a carefully chosen bullet in the chamber. Then, with a final, decisive click of the mouse, Ben submitted it. The email was sent, the trap was set. I leaned back in my chair, a wave of exhaustion and adrenaline washing over me. I felt a grim satisfaction, but it was tangled with a profound, aching sadness. I was a mother, and I had just meticulously planned the public destruction of my own son. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a surgery to be performed, a painful, necessary excision to remove a cancer that threatened to consume everything. The abstract was out there now, a quiet, professional declaration of war. The bait was in the water. All we had to do now was wait for the sharks to notice the blood. Waiting, I've discovered, is its own form of combat. It is a war waged in silence, a battle of nerve and patience. After Ben and I submitted the abstract, the world seemed to fall quiet, but it was a deceptive stillness, like the breathless calm before a storm. The trap was set, the mechanism armed, and every day that passed was another turn of the screw, tightening the tension on a wire I knew must eventually snap. I continued the slow, mournful task of packing my life into boxes, but my purpose had changed. Before, it was a surrender. Now, it was a strategic retreat. I worked methodically, my mind oscillating between the dusty memories contained in a photo album and the clean, sharp lines of the presentation I was preparing. On my dining table, which was now my command center, two piles of paper sat in stark contrast. A stack of change of address forms for the post office, and the growing collection of data, charts, and speaking notes for San Diego. One represented the life my children had tried to sentence me to, the other, the verdict I was preparing to deliver myself. The first tremor came 2 weeks after we set our plan in motion. It came, as I expected, through Ben. I had lunch with an old friend today, he said over the phone, his voice carefully neutral. A man named David Chen. He's on the scientific advisory board for the Neuroinnovation Symposium. And? I asked, my heart giving a slight lurch. And our abstract is causing a stir, Ben said. It's all very professional, of course. No one knows who is behind the research yet. But the topic, specifically the part about stochastic resonance cascades, has raised some eyebrows. It's a direct challenge to the presumed stability of the new diagnostic models. David said a few members of the board have already reached out to their contacts at Omni Farm, asking if their new acquisition has been stress tested for this kind of signal contamination. The first ripple had reached the shore. Thank you, Ben, I said, a cold, grim satisfaction settling over me. Let me know if you hear anything else. I didn't have to wait long. The next evening, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mason's name. I let it ring 3 times before answering, composing my voice into a mask of gentle, maternal warmth. Mason, dear, how are you? I'm busy, Mom. He snapped, his voice tight and frayed. The easy confidence of the CEO was gone, replaced by the raw irritation of a man under pressure. Listen, weird question. Have you been talking to any of your old colleagues from the university recently? I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat too long. No, honey, why would you ask? I haven't spoken to anyone from that life in years. No reason, he said quickly, too quickly. It's just we're hitting some bureaucratic headaches with the Omni Farm deal. They're in their final due diligence, and suddenly they're asking for an insane level of validation on the foundational data. They're asking questions nobody was asking a month ago. It's like someone put a bug in their ear. Oh dear, that sounds stressful, I said, my voice dripping with a sympathy I did not feel. I'm sure you'll handle it. You're always so good at handling things. He made a frustrated noise. Yeah, well, I have to go. I'll talk to you later. He hung up without saying goodbye. I placed the phone down, allowing myself a small, thin smile. The bait was working. He could feel the net tightening, but had no idea who was holding the rope. My next move was on a different front. Olivia's world was not one of scientific advisory boards and due diligence. It was a carefully curated fantasy land of social media. Her Instagram feed was a relentless parade of success. Photos of her and Mason clinking champagne glasses captioned, "Family celebrating success, #Aura Health." Shots of her in expensive clothes, links to articles praising her brother's genius. It was a castle built of light and filters. I created an anonymous profile. My avatar was the university crest of a prestigious European institution. My bio simply read, Professor Emeritus, Bioethics and Scientific Integrity. Then, I found Olivia's most popular post about the acquisition, the one with hundreds of fawning comments. I added my own. It was not an accusation. It was a question. A fascinating achievement in computational biology. As this technology will impact millions of lives, I'm sure the public would be very interested in seeing the peer-reviewed data on the algorithm's testing protocols, specifically regarding its verified false positive rates under non-ideal conditions. Rigorous, transparent science is, after all, the foundation of public trust. Congratulations on this exciting new chapter. The comment was a surgical strike. It was polite, academic, and utterly devastating. It planted a seed of doubt in the most fertile ground possible. Within hours, it had a dozen likes. Then other comments started to appear beneath it. That's a great point. Where can we see the data? I work in medical tech, and they're right to ask this. 2 days later, Olivia called me. She was furious. Mom, what did you do? She shrieked, foregoing any greeting. Olivia, what on earth are you talking about? My Instagram, someone is trying to sabotage me and Mason. They're leaving these horrible, technical comments on my posts. And now people are asking all these questions, and a tech blogger even wrote a post about it. It's ruining my engagement. Is it you? Did you do this? Olivia, darling, I said, my voice the calm center of her hurricane. I barely know how to post a photo of a flower from my garden. It sounds to me like you simply have some very educated followers. You should be proud. She sputtered, unable to form a coherent argument against my placid denial. I have to go, she finally said and hung up. I had not raised my voice. I had not made a single accusation. I had simply whispered the truth into the wind, and now I could sit back and watch as it eroded the foundations of their glass castle, one grain of sand at a time. The cracks were appearing. The pressure was building. From what Ben could gather through the grapevine, Mason was becoming a tyrant at work, demanding answers his team couldn't provide. Olivia, for the first time, was facing a narrative she couldn't control. A week before the symposium, an official confirmation packet arrived in the mail. It contained my plane tickets to San Diego, my hotel reservation, and my speaker's badge. I held the badge in my hand, my name printed in bold black letters, Dr. Evelyn Reed. The countdown had begun. A stage is a peculiar kind of island. For a few brief moments, it makes you the most visible person in the world, and also the most alone. Standing in the wings of the main auditorium of the San Diego Convention Center, the low, expectant murmur of 1,000 attendees felt like a distant ocean tide. The air was cool, but a single bead of sweat traced a path down my spine. This was it, the culmination of weeks of silent, furious work, of a lifetime of suppressed ambition. Ben stood beside me. He didn't offer any last-minute words of encouragement. He knew I didn't need them. Instead, he simply placed a steadying hand on my shoulder for a brief moment. It was enough. It said, "You are not alone." And now, the moderator's voice boomed from the stage, presenting her groundbreaking research on signal contamination in predictive neural models. Please welcome a respected voice returning to our field, Dr. Evelyn Reed. The polite applause was a soft, rolling wave. I walked from the darkness of the wings into the blinding white light of the stage. The podium felt solid and real under my hands, an anchor in a sea of faceless silhouettes. As my eyes adjusted to the glare, the audience began to resolve into individual faces, and I saw them. They were in the 10th row center aisle. Mason was leaning forward, his hands clasped, a tense, forced smile on his face. He was playing the part of the supportive son for the few colleagues around him who knew of our relation. Olivia was beside him, already looking bored, her attention on her phone. They had no idea. They saw their mother, a retired academic with a small, irrelevant presentation. They did not see the architect of their ruin. My eyes then scanned the front row. There they were, the Sharks. A row of men in impeccably tailored suits, their conference badges all bearing the same corporate logo, Omni Farm. Their faces were relaxed, confident, the expressions of men who had just spent $200 million and were certain they had bought the future. I took a deep breath, looked out at the vast, silent room, and began. "Good morning," I said, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the microphone. It was the voice of Dr. Reed, a voice that had commanded lecture halls and led research teams. It was a voice my children had likely never heard. I started with the past. For the first 10 minutes, I spoke about my early, foundational research. I put up slides of my original notes, my theoretical models from 2 decades ago. I was not just presenting science, I was laying a claim. I was planting a flag in the intellectual territory that was rightfully mine, establishing for the record where these ideas had originated. I could feel the energy in the room shift. This was not the dry, incremental update they had been expecting. This was a story. From my vantage point, I saw Olivia look up from her phone, a flicker of confused recognition on her face. Mason's smile had vanished. Then I made the pivot. This research, I continued, my tone becoming more urgent, was for many years purely theoretical, a starting point. It has recently come to my attention, however, that this specific predictive model is no longer theoretical. It is, in fact, being actively deployed as the basis for a commercial diagnostic tool. I clicked to the next slide. It was a simple, stark title against a white background. Case Study, a simulation of the unchecked model. What happens, I asked the silent room, when you take a prototype and treat it as a finished product? What happens when you build an empire on a foundation you do not fully understand? For the next 15 minutes, I gave them the answer. I didn't show them lines of code. I showed them the consequences. A new slide appeared behind me, a bar chart with a single, brutal column of red. Our simulation, stress testing the model with common, non-ideal data sets, revealed a catastrophic flaw. I explained, my voice devoid of emotion, letting the data speak for itself. A 40% false positive rate. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. In the front row, the Omni Farm executives were no longer relaxed. They were sitting bolt upright, whispering furiously to one another. I clicked again. The next slide showed two brain scans, side by side. One healthy, one showing advanced decay. "What this error rate means in human terms," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "is that a healthy 45-year-old man or woman could be handed a diagnosis for a debilitating neurological disease. It means a family could be told to prepare for a future of loss and grief that is not, in fact, coming. It is a diagnosis that is a death sentence of the mind. And this model, as it is currently designed, is an engine for producing them nearly half the time. Now, I could see the full scope of the chaos my words had unleashed. Phones were out, their screens glowing in the dim light. People were typing furiously. The polite academic interest had evaporated, replaced by a charged, frenzied atmosphere of scandal. I looked at my children. Olivia's face was ashen, her hand covering her mouth. Mason was staring at me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood had drained from his face, leaving his skin a waxy, pale yellow. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at a ghost who had risen from the grave of her own forgotten past to condemn him. He finally understood. I concluded my presentation. The pursuit of innovation is noble, I said. But innovation without rigor, without ethics, is not progress. It is a danger to us all. Thank you. A stunned, heavy silence filled the hall. Then, the moderator, looking flustered, stepped to the microphone. Thank you, Dr. Reed. We have time for a few questions. A hand in the front row shot up. It was one of the Omni Farm executives, a man with silver hair and a grim, tight jaw. He didn't wait to be called on. He stood up, his voice sharp with anger and panic. Dr. Reed, he said, his voice cutting through the silence. A fascinating and deeply troubling presentation. For the sake of absolute clarity, could you please confirm if the flawed architectural model you've simulated tonight bears any resemblance to the recently patented algorithm from the company known as Aura Health? The trap had sprung. The accusation was now in the air, spoken not by me, but by the very man who had been swindled. I looked out at the audience, at the hundreds of eyes now fixated on me, waiting for the final blow. I met the executive's gaze. I cannot speak to any specific company's proprietary technology, I said, my voice calm and measured. I can only present the data. The data, as you can see, speaks for itself. I saw the flash of a camera from the press section. I saw the executive director of Omni Farm bury his face in his hands. And I saw my son Mason stand up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor and push his way blindly towards the exit. His face, a portrait of a man who had just watched his entire world burn to the ground. The truth, once released, is no longer yours. It becomes a wildfire, and all you can do is watch what it chooses to consume. In the moments after I stepped down from the stage, the wildfire I had ignited roared to life. The auditorium, once a place of quiet academic discourse, erupted into a cacophony of chaos. I was immediately swarmed, a tiny, fixed point in a swirling vortex of shouting reporters, stunned scientists wanting to shake my hand, and pale, frantic-looking men in suits who I correctly assumed were Omni Farm's legal team. Ben was a rock in the storm. He materialized at my side, shielding me from the worst of the onslaught, his voice a calm, authoritative barrier. Dr. Reed has no further comment at this time. A formal statement will be issued through the university. He guided me through the throng, his hand on my elbow, leading me away from the flashing cameras and the clamor of a world waking up to a scandal. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the hotel. We didn't need to. The evidence of our victory was everywhere. On the television in the hotel lobby, a financial news channel had already broken away from its regular programming. The headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen in stark, red letters. Omnipharm halts $200M acquisition of Aura Health pending, urgent scientific review. My son's face, the same confident portrait from the magazine cover, was now next to the headline, forever linked to words like fraud, scandal, and scientific misconduct. The wildfire was spreading faster than I could have imagined. Back in the sterile quiet of my hotel room, I watched the empire I had funded burn. By evening, every major news outlet had picked up the story. Tech blogs were furiously dissecting my presentation, which Ben had already uploaded to the university's public server. The scientific community was in an uproar. #Oragate was trending on Twitter. Omni Farm stock had plummeted 17% in afternoon trading, wiping out billions of dollars in market value. The verdict of the world was swift, brutal, and unanimous. I felt a strange, hollow detachment from it all. There was no joy, no triumphant sense of revenge. I had merely presented a set of facts. The world and the market had done the rest. I had set a heavy stone rolling downhill, and now I could only watch its destructive path. The knock on my door came just after 10 o'clock. I knew who it was. I had been waiting for them. When I opened the door, the two glittering star-like beings from the summit were gone. In their place stood the wreckage. Mason's expensive suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his face pale and shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. He looked like a man who had aged a decade since breakfast. Olivia was beside him, her face stripped of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. The effortless glamour that had been her armor was gone, leaving her looking young, lost, and terrified. They entered the room without an invitation, two ghosts haunting the scene of their own demise. "How could you?" Mason whispered, the words ragged. It was not a question, it was an accusation. "How could you do this to us, to your own family?" "You have to fix this, Mom," Olivia pleaded, her voice cracking. "You have to issue a statement. Tell them it was a misunderstanding, a professional disagreement. Tell them something." I walked over to the armchair by the window and sat down, gesturing for them to take the sofa opposite me. I was calm. It was a strange, absolute calm, the kind that comes when you have already faced the worst and survived. I had nothing left to lose, and it had made me invincible. I let them talk. I listened as they poured out their panic, their fear, their self-pity. They spoke of the canceled deal, the impending lawsuits, the public humiliation. They spoke of everything they were about to lose. Not once did they speak of what they had done. Not once did they say the words, "I'm sorry." When they finally fell silent, their desperation hanging in the air between us like smoke, I spoke. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "There is no misunderstanding to clarify," I said. "There is only a truth that has finally been told, and there is a debt that must be paid." "Debt?" Mason scoffed, a pathetic echo of his former arrogance. "The money. You did this all for the money?" "The money was the least of it," I said, my gaze level and unyielding. "You took my savings, yes, but you also stole my work, Mason. You took my mind, my legacy, and you built a monument to yourself upon it. You, Olivia, stood by and applauded. Then together you sat across from me in a restaurant built on that foundation, and you called me an unnecessary expense. You tried to erase me." I let the words settle, letting them feel the full weight of their actions. "So, no," I continued, "I will not fix this, but I will tell you what is going to happen now." They stared at me, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. I was no longer their mother, a soft place to land. I was a force they did not recognize, and I was delivering a verdict. "First," I said, "Aura Health, or what's left of it, will issue a public statement. It will name me, Dr. Evelyn Reed, as the foundational researcher behind the core technology. My name will be restored to my work. Second, the patents for that technology, which are now legally worthless to you, will be transferred to a new trust under my exclusive control. My intellectual property will be returned to me. And third," I said, delivering the final blow, "the $1 million I invested, an amount you dismissed as a gift, was not a gift. It was a business investment that was stolen through fraud. That money, adjusted for the initial valuation of the company it created, will be returned to me from whatever assets you have left. Consider it a fee for the lesson you have just learned in business ethics." Mason's face crumpled. "That's everything," he whispered. "That will destroy us." I stood up, the meeting concluded. "You destroyed yourselves," I said, my voice softening with a flicker of an old, buried sorrow. "You destroyed everything that mattered long before you walked into that conference hall today. What is happening now is not revenge. It is merely a reckoning." I walked to the door and held it open. "I believe you know the way out." After they left, I stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the glittering, indifferent lights of the city. The silence in the room was no longer the silence of grief. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the war is over. The fight was done. The victory was mine, but it tasted of ashes. Justice, I realized, was not about balancing the scales. It was about taking your hand off the scale entirely and letting the truth apply its own inexorable weight. An ending is rarely a slammed door. More often, it is a quiet turning of a key in a lock you no longer need to open. In the months that followed the symposium in San Diego, the noisy, brutal demolition of my children's empire happened at a distance. I watched it not with satisfaction, but with the detached sadness of a physician observing a painful but necessary surgery. Ben and a team of lawyers handled the specifics. The transfer of the patents was a quiet affair of signatures and filings. The liquidation of Aura Health's remaining assets and the restitution of my investment happened in the sterile, emotionless world of bank transfers. Mason and Olivia, facing a mountain of legal challenges and public disgrace, complied with every one of my demands. They had no other choice. The truth, once unleashed, had left them with nothing to bargain with. I did not take the money and retreat into a quiet, comfortable retirement. The woman who might have done that, the one who dreamed of a peaceful old age, had died in that rooftop restaurant. A different woman had taken her place, and that woman had work to do. With the considerable resources now at my command, I didn't buy a new, lavish apartment. I didn't travel the world. Instead, I created something. I established the Reed Institute for Ethical Science, a nonprofit foundation headquartered not in a glittering skyscraper, but in a modest, red brick building on the very same street as the university where I had started my career. I named it not after myself, but in memory of my parents, using the money from the sale of their home, the money that had started this whole painful journey, to give it its foundation. It was an act of restoration, of rebuilding a legacy on the ground where it had first been sacrificed. My mission was simple: to fund the kind of brilliant, methodical, and ethically minded young scientists who are so often overlooked in a world that prizes quick profits over patient research. We provided grants, lab space, and mentorship. I was not a distant benefactor. I was in the lab every day. I found a joy I thought I had lost forever in the thrill of a new hypothesis, in the collaborative energy of a shared discovery, in mentoring a new generation of minds. I was no longer just a mother or an investor. I was Dr. Reed again. I was home. I did not see or speak to Mason or Olivia. The legal proceedings were handled through intermediaries. I heard through Ben that they had lost everything. They sold their homes, their cars, their glittering lives, and moved to a small town in the Midwest, seeking the anonymity of a life without headlines. Olivia's social media empire had vanished overnight, deleted in a puff of digital smoke. Mason, I was told, was working in a consulting role far removed from the world of medical tech. Part of me, a deep and ancient maternal part, ached for the children who were lost. But the woman I had become knew that what they had lost was a world they had built on a foundation of lies. Perhaps now, on solid ground, they could build something real. 6 months after the symposium, a letter arrived at the Institute. It was addressed to me in Mason's handwriting. For a full day, I left it unopened on my desk, a white ghost from a past I was trying to outrun. Finally, I opened it. It was not long. There were no excuses, no pleas for forgiveness. It was the simple, humbled letter of a man who had been completely broken and was just beginning to put the pieces back together. Mom, it began. I am working a job now where I help companies streamline their logistics. I track shipments, I make spreadsheets. No one knows my name. There is a quietness to it that I haven't known in years. For the first time, I think I am beginning to understand. All those years, I was chasing a number. $1 million, $10 million, $200 million. I thought that number was the destination. I never stopped to ask what the journey was costing me or what it had already cost you. You were a scientist first. I think I forgot that, or maybe I never truly knew it. I am sorry, Mason. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. The tears that came were not tears of anger or even of sadness. They were tears of release. He had finally seen me. It was too late to repair what was broken, but the acknowledgement was a balm on a wound I didn't know was still open. I did not write back. There was nothing left to say. The story was over. My life now is full. It is full of the quiet hum of equipment, the excited chatter of young scientists, and the profound satisfaction of work that matters. Sometimes I stand at the window of my office and look out at the city. It is the same city that once seemed so cold and unforgiving. but my perspective has changed. I am no longer looking up at it from the ground, nor down upon it from a borrowed summit. I am in it, a part of its endless, striving energy, building something that will hopefully outlast me. I did not get my old life back. I forged a new one, stronger and more authentic than the last. I have learned that a legacy is not what you leave for your children, but what you build within yourself. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it serves as a reminder to you all, a reminder of the strength that lies within us, often hidden until the moment we need it most. Cherish your families, but never, ever forget to cherish yourselves. I wish you all good health, happiness, and the unwavering love of a family that sees you for who you truly are.